Okay, so the last presentation thing was about Spain and journalism in Spain, and I talked about the schools and whatnot that were there in Spain, some of the most popular schools that journalism students went to. So now, today I'm going to talk about where journalism students can go in Spain, um, depending on what type of career they want to do in journalism. So the first one is going to be newspapers in Spain. So a quick little backstory, or first off, there's 136 daily newspapers compared to 1,300 in the United States. Extremely small number compared to the United States. But there is a good reason for it, because after 1939, newspapers were controlled by the government's rule, and the king decided that he wanted good news about the government only to be produced there, and nobody could talk bad about the government. It was all limited. There was no freedom of the press like there is in the United States at all, and that really shook up the newspapers that were there before. And then it would dwindle down to just a couple newspapers that the government allowed to have, and that included a newspaper called ABC. And they were kind of one of the first newspapers still going, but the government limited them. So in 1975, once the king died, then newspapers started to be able to write what they wanted. It changed everything. It changed Spain's course of history, not just in media, but other things as well. And this was huge for Spain. It let newspapers be newspapers and actually report the news as they saw it. So because of this, organizations were created. So first, one of the main things is journalism students have to graduate from a recognized college, which is pretty easy because the colleges there's not too many journalism colleges, and they're all probably recognized under the government or whatever as a journalism college that is suited to get them registered with the government. You have to get registered, which is completely odd, and that's something that the United States used to do back in American Revolutionary days, and now Spain still does this to this date. And once you do that, you can choose these organizations. There's about 50 of them. There's over 4,000 journalists in Spain that are able to go to these organizations, and some are small, some are huge, some are labor unions, and they join these organizations to be protected as journalists in Spain, which is really interesting. So once you do this, you're able to join newspapers, radio, television, stuff like that. So one of the huge newspapers in Spain, the biggest probably by far, is El País, and it was formed in 1976, so right after the king had died, and it grew massively, and it's one of the first liberal type newspapers in Spain. Nobody really experienced it, but it was a pretty progressive movement going past what happened with the king and going forward. That's why it became really popular, and it really focused on international news, and that's what kind of made it what kind of started it, and it still is today. It's really heavy international based, so it's a huge European type newspaper, I could argue as well, and it's really basically the gold standard in Europe, or gold standard in Spain for a newspaper, and they have an internet version as well, so there's more than just the physical newspapers, and it's regional based too. That's why it's hugely popular, because of different regions in Spain. You're able to reach more people with regional based newspapers. El Mundo is another huge one. This one was founded in 1989, so it's pretty recent, to be honest, and 80 pages per copy is massive, and it's almost like a book, but that's because it focuses heavily on investigative journalism. So if a student wanted to go out and they wanted to be in investigative journalism, this is where they would want to go, and it's known for their investigative journalism. That's why it's 80 pages, and they've had different stories exposing companies, exposing organizations, and stuff like that. So El Mundo is big on investigative journalism, and that's why it's so long. Then you got television, which is really interesting. Over 90% of the population watches television daily. That's huge. That's over 3 hours spent on TV per day, which is probably, I know for a fact it's very close to what the United States averages per day for Americans. And Spain really found out that they love receiving the news from television. That's why it's so popular. That's why so many people watch it. And some of the popular include TVE1 and Antena 3. This is just great for journalists who want to get into TV because Spain is a hot spot for viewership, to get a lot of people to view you on television. This is where you want to go in Spain if you really want to be in the spotlight. Radio is another huge way to get into journalism in Spain. Over 280 AM stations, 215 FM stations, and it's hugely popular. Probably Radio audience, they say, is pretty much the biggest you're going to get in Spain because it's just widely available, widely popular. It's one of the first where people could talk on the radio about anything and not be really censored. And because of that, it grew so large that there's so many stations, as you can see, almost 1,000, and people were able to talk about what they want, which means it got more popular than newspapers and television simply because there was no restriction on it because of the government back in the 30s. Some of those popular include RNE, COPE, and then SER, which is the most popular radio station in Spain. Then you've got sports, and sports is really interesting because if you go to Spain, and you will probably notice that they talk about sports and football a lot. And that's what I read in a couple of articles when I was researching this topic was football is number one, football is number one, soccer is number one. Soccer, football, whatever you want to call it, is number one in Spain. And it's number one in Spain, it's number one in Europe, really, and number one across the world if you did kind of discount the United States. It's so popular that's basically, if you look through these tabloids or online newspapers, that's all they talk about. And people students who want to get into sports journalism, Spain, and if you really love football, then you should really try this out because they've got some great news organizations. Marca, El Mundo Deportivo, and then Super Deporte is the three most popular, really, tabloid / online news organizations for sports. And people are constantly talking about sports. There's lots of drama in Spain sports, I've noticed. Reading some articles and whatnot for other cultural activities. And I think students will find sports in Spain to be pretty popular, and especially football, and it's a great way to kind of get into sports journalism outside of the United States.